In the Amazon jungle, there is a simple rule. If you get lost, you have a maximum of 72 hours before the forest swallows you up forever. In May 2002, two American tourists set out on what was supposed to be a 2-hour walk along a well-trodden trail near a small Brazilian hostel. They took a couple of bottles of water and snacks for one day. 6 days later, one of them would be ready to kill himself, just to end the nightmare. What happened in the largest tropical forest on Earth proves that sometimes the most terrifying traps are not created by nature, but by a single misunderstood word. The plan cost $6,000 and took 4 years to wait. For 23-year-old David Boyer, an economics student, it was a methodical investment in a dream, a trip to the Amazon with 21-year-old Crystal Ramsey. Boyer didn't fit the image of an adventurer. Still, his savings, accumulated from his salary as a video store cashier, were supposed to bring to life an idea that had emerged 4 years earlier. In 1998, he met Crystal Ramsey. Unlike Dave, Crystal had an evident passion that was unusual for an engineering student, working with large predators. She was interested not just in wild animals, but specifically in top predators, lions, tigers, and cougars. This was a field that required not only knowledge, but also a special character, the ability to remain calm in the face of obvious danger. They were united by a common interest in wildlife, and it was then that the idea of a trip to the Amazon was formulated, a decision that would become key in their future history. Their romantic relationship ended a year later due to distance. Crystal left to work with lions in South Africa, while Dave remained in the United States. However, the plan for a joint trip remained, and for Dave, it took on an additional purpose. He saw this journey as an opportunity to rebuild their relationship by overcoming difficulties together. But there was a critical variable in this equation that Boyer was unaware of. Ramsey was undergoing treatment for clinical depression and was taking powerful antidepressants. This undisclosed fact introduced an element of risk into their journey that could not be accounted for in any plan. On May 24, 2002, after a long journey through São Paulo and Manaus, Dave and Crystal reached their final destination, the Amazonia Youth Hostel. It was a simple structure located in complete isolation on the edge of the pristine rainforest that was the goal of their trip. They were greeted by the hostess, Brazilian Nail Maldonado. Communication was complicated by her limited knowledge of English. To explain, she used a sheet of paper on which she drew a schematic diagram of the hostel grounds. She then drew a line beyond the diagram, indicating a tourist route known as the White Trail. According to her, the trail began behind the kitchen, was marked with white arrows, and was a loop leading to the river and back. This brief instruction contained a key translation error. To indicate the destination of the route, Maldonado used the Portuguese word igarapé, which she translated into English as river. However, in the local dialect, igarapé does not mean a full-flowing river, but rather a small forest stream or a marshy backwater. For Dave and Crystal, the word river conjured up an image of a prominent landmark, possibly with signs of civilization, a pier or a settlement. On the morning of May 28th, they gathered their gear for a short walk. Their backpack contained light snacks, 3 liters of water, mosquito repellent, a Swiss Army knife, and a small compass on Dave's watch bracelet. They had a standard set of hiking gear and planned to return by lunchtime. Leaving the hostel on a sunny morning, they were in high spirits. The dream they had been working toward for 4 years was beginning to come true. They left behind the relative safety of the hostel. They entered a 4 million square mile forest ecosystem, an environment where visibility is limited to a few feet, and any landmark can be misleading. On May 28th at 10:00 a.m., Dave Boyer and Crystal Ramsey set out on their route. The trail, known as the White Trail, was wide, easily distinguishable, and, as they were told, marked with white chalk arrows on tree trunks. For the first 2 hours, the system worked flawlessly. They moved deeper into the forest, stopping to take photos of the surroundings. For them, it was the culmination of a dream they had been nurturing for 4 years, and there was no indication that anything would go wrong. A critical mistake was made around noon. Their attention was drawn to a sound, bird song, coming from what they estimated to be no more than 100 feet from the trail. Immediately after that, they heard the sound of falling water. In Dave and Crystal's minds, this sound was immediately linked to the information they had received at the hostel. The trail was supposed to lead them to a river. They assumed that the waterfall was part of this river system and that once they found it, they would be able to reach the main route. The decision to leave the trail at that moment seemed logical and safe to them. They stepped off the beaten path into the undergrowth. Their progress immediately slowed. They had to push aside vines and step over fallen trees. After about half an hour, still not having reached the source of the noise, they decided to turn back. It was at this moment that they discovered that there was no trail. In no direction were there any white chalk marks or even a hint of a clearing. In the Amazon rainforest, where dense vegetation limits visibility to 16 feet, the human eye loses its ability to find landmarks. Every direction looked identical to the previous one. Dave turned to the only navigation device they had, a miniature compass on his watch bracelet. It pointed north. But in a forest where the terrain and vegetation prevent you from moving in a straight line and force you to constantly deviate, bypassing obstacles, the compass readings lose their practical meaning. They did not know at what point they had strayed from the route and could no longer plot a vector for their return. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, after nearly 4 hours of wandering, they came to an obstacle, a swampy floodplain about 160 feet wide. The surface of the stagnant water was covered with a thick layer of green duckweed, from which tree trunks blackened by moisture protruded. For Dave, this discovery confirmed his theory. In his mind, this swampy backwater perfectly matched the broken English description of river, Agarape, given by the hostel owner. It was a powerful psychological anchor. They weren't just wandering, they had found a landmark. The confidence that they were back on track was so strong that they crossed the floodplain without hesitation, knee-deep in warm, murky water. There was indeed a trail on the opposite bank, but its characteristics were strikingly different from the white trail. It was a narrow, barely noticeable clearing, no more than 2 feet wide, obviously made by animals. It forced them to walk in single file, constantly ducking under overhanging branches. The key fact they ignored at the time was the complete absence of white chalk marks, but hope proved more decisive than objective data. 2 hours later, around 4 p.m., the animal trail came to an impassable barrier, the trunk of a giant fallen tree. Dave climbed up to assess the situation. There was nothing beyond the obstacle. No continuation of the trail, no clearing, only a solid, impenetrable wall of vegetation. At that moment, subjective hope collided with objective reality. Dave climbed down to Crystal. Analysis of the situation left no room for optimism. They were in an unknown location in a 4 million square mile rainforest, without a map, navigation, or communication. Their 2-hour walk had officially turned into a struggle for survival. As dusk fell, the acoustic environment changed rapidly. The sounds of daytime birds and insects gave way to the repertoire of nocturnal species, creating a dense, unfamiliar soundscape. Physical conditions also deteriorated. With the temperature hovering around 86 degrees, the humidity reached 88%. In such an environment, sweat evaporation from the skin almost stops, leading to the risk of overheating even without physical exertion. Dave's initial plan was to maintain high morale. They settled down for the night under the roots of a large tree, intending to stay awake and talk until dawn. Their only protective resource, mosquito repellent, was practical for the first few hours. However, after it evaporated, the insects began a systematic attack on any unprotected area of skin. Added to this was another factor: absolute darkness. In the lower canopy of the rainforest, after sunset and without moonlight, visibility drops to 0. This is an objective condition in which the human eye is unable to distinguish even the contours of its own hand stretched out in front of its face. Complete visual deprivation, compounded by constant physical irritants and an unfamiliar sound environment, became the first severe test for their psyche. Their plan to spend the night talking failed. All their energy went into fighting the external conditions. On May 29th, the second day, dehydration became the main problem. By noon, their supply of bottled water was utterly exhausted. This forced them to take a calculated risk, drinking from forest streams. They tried to filter the murky, chalky-tasting water through a piece of cloth. However, this measure could only remove visible dirt, leaving them vulnerable to the primary danger: microbes and parasites found in the water in this region, which can cause serious illness. At the same time, their meager food supplies were dwindling. Under increasing physical and psychological pressure, Dave decided to take a systematic approach. He initiated a search technique known as expanding squares. Using a compass, he set a direction in which they would move for a certain amount of time. First 5 minutes, then, on the next turn of the square, 10, then 15. The theoretical goal of this method is to systematically comb the area to increase the likelihood of crossing a trail or other linear landmark. However, this methodical but counterintuitive strategy became a point of psychological friction. For Crystal, whose condition was deteriorating, the idea of walking in circles in the forest seemed absurd and counterproductive. She emphasized the importance of choosing one direction and sticking to it. This was the first recorded clash between their approaches to survival: Dave's logical but energy-consuming method versus Crystal's instinctive but risky impulse. By the evening of the second day, it was clear that Dave's tactic had not worked. Each square they covered only brought them back to the same landscape, reinforcing the most demoralizing of all possible feelings: the assumption of the infinity and absolute monotony of the space surrounding them. On May 30th, the third day, a change in tactics occurred. Analysis of the previous 48 hours showed that searching by squares in dense forest was ineffective and led to excessive energy expenditure. A new, more straightforward strategy was adopted: to move strictly southeast by compass. To distribute the physical and cognitive load, they introduced a rotation system in which the leader changed every 2 hours. The leader was responsible for navigation and route planning, while the follower could conserve mental resources by simply following him. The problem of hydration was solved with improvised means. Forest streams served as a source of water, and Crystal's bra fabric was used as a filter. This method allowed only large particles to be removed from the murky water with a chalky taste, but did not protect against microorganisms. By this point, their diet had been reduced to almost nothing. Food supplies were exhausted. In the evening, they attempted to create a more reliable night shelter. While gathering palm branches, Crystal used psychological motivation. She promised Dave a kiss for each branch he brought, on the condition that he would receive his reward after they were rescued. This future-oriented technique proved effective. Dave collected 47 large branches, from which they built a conical shelter. By the end of the third day, their actions had become systematic. They had a strategy for moving around, a method for obtaining water, and a well-equipped shelter. From an outside perspective, it was a successful adaptation to a hostile environment. On the night of May 30th, 31, the situation deteriorated. The temperature dropped unexpectedly, and swarms of mosquitoes made rest unbearable. Dave's random thought came to the rescue. He remembered how the mosquitoes had not touched the part of his skin that was smeared with mud that morning. This simple observation prompted them to make a decision that would seem crazy in everyday life. They dug a hole about 3 feet deep in the ground and completely covered their bodies with mud from a stream. The method proved immediately effective. The layer of mud created a barrier that the insects could not overcome. For the first time in 72 hours, they were able to sleep. However, around midnight, the solution to one problem created another, more serious one. A tropical downpour began, and its intensity continued to increase. Their shelter, the mud pit, began to function as a water collector. By 1 a.m., water had accumulated at the bottom of the pit, and by 2 a.m., the water level had reached their chins, creating a direct threat of drowning. In complete darkness under pouring rain, they were forced to leave their trap and seek shelter in the open. They took refuge at the trunk of a large tree, at the mercy of the storm. Flashes of lightning every few seconds illuminated the chaotic scene, streams of water and the sounds of falling trees all around. The combination of wet clothes and low temperatures caused rapid hypothermia. Uncontrollable shivering was its first symptom. The only method available to them to reduce heat loss was to huddle close together. They spent the rest of the night in this position, waiting for dawn. On the morning of May 31st, the physical ordeal of the previous night was replaced by a psychological one. After experiencing hypothermia and stress, Crystal's behavior changed dramatically. Dave noticed that she was entirely apathetic and emotionally detached. She moved mechanically without any visible sign of will. Dave could not know the actual reason for this change. Her condition was caused not only by trauma, but also by biochemical processes. More than 3 days had passed since she had taken her last dose of antidepressants. Withdrawal syndrome, compounded by her clinical depression, triggered an acute psychological breakdown. As they prepared to continue their journey, Crystal issued an ultimatum. "I can't take another night like this. We have to get out of here today or I won't make it." The statement was made without emotion, which gave it the weight of an objective fact rather than a panicked threat. For Dave, it was a signal that he was losing his only ally. Crystal's ultimatum added a new element to their desperate situation, a psychological countdown. Now Dave was fighting not only the jungle, but also his partner's fading will. Under this pressure, on June 1st, they continued on their way. Suddenly, the forest opened up before them, and they emerged onto a sandy clearing. After 4 days spent in a closed green world, where all they could see was a solid wall of leaves a few feet from their faces, this break in the vegetation had a powerful effect on them. The opportunity to see the sky, feel the sun, and breathe dry air temporarily lifted the oppressive feeling of confinement. However, this hope was deceptive. In the trees surrounding the clearing, they spotted harpy eagles, predators that serve as a bioindicator. These birds nest only in the deepest, most untouched areas of the forest, which served as objective confirmation of their complete isolation. By evening, Dave's psychological state also began to falter. He caught a fly and, sitting on the sand, systematically tore off its legs and wings. In survival psychology, such behavior is interpreted as displacement. When faced with an uncontrollable threat, a person projects their powerlessness onto an object that they can control. It was a symptom of a deep internal breakdown and acceptance of the likely outcome. By the end of the 5th day, Dave and Crystal had reached a point of physiological and psychological exhaustion. Further resistance seemed pointless. In this situation, Dave formulated a final strategy. He proposed setting a deadline of 6 p.m. the next day. If they did not find a way out by then, they would stop fighting for their lives. Crystal agreed without discussion, which was indicative of their shared sense of hopelessness. They had one more day ahead of them to either find salvation or accept death. For the first time in a long time, Dave, a staunch atheist, found himself turning to God. It was not a conscious prayer. Instead, it was a kind of psychological bargain, a desperate appeal typical of situations where all control has been lost. He promised to believe if he received a sign and they survived. However, the key decision that morning was different. Dave expressed an idea that shifted their focus from survival to preserving their human dignity. He insisted that before the appointed time, they must find water and wash themselves, cleansing themselves of the dirt. In his words, they had to meet the end not as hunted animals, but as human beings. This decision paradoxically gave them back a purpose and meaning. Their new task was not to find a way out, but to perform a final ritual of self-respect. On June 6th, the 6th day, Dave woke up and assessed their physical condition. Their exhaustion was evident. Over the past few days, Crystal had lost a lot of weight, and her legs were covered with numerous lacerations from thorny plants. Every movement required superhuman effort on her part. Dave himself was experiencing symptoms of extreme exhaustion. They had had virtually no food for 4 days, except for a few berries of unknown nutritional value. According to their calculations, they had consumed no more than 150 calories in 6 days. Their bodies had entered a state of catabolism, a process in which the body begins to break down its own muscle tissue to maintain vital functions. By noon, it became clear that their calculations were correct. Crystal's ability to move was reduced to short distances of a few feet, after which she needed to rest. Her physical weakness was compounded by the effects of withdrawal and depression. Dave came to the logical conclusion that by evening, their energy reserves would be completely depleted, and the next day they would be physically unable to continue their journey. At 2:00 p.m., they heard an encouraging sound. It was the sound of water, but its volume and complexity differed from the familiar murmur of streams. Dave saw this as an opportunity to carry out their morning decision. He told Crystal that they could finally wash themselves before they died. Clinging to roots and branches, they began a slow descent down the slope toward the sound. The landscape that opened up below them was not a stream, but a seasonally flooded forest, an Igapo. It was another world, a vast open expanse of water from which trees grew like columns. Dave entered the water first. After several days of sticky heat, the coolness of the water provided immediate physiological relief. He felt the heat subside, and the buoyancy took the strain off his wounded legs. Crystal followed him. Their tactics changed again. Now they swam, clinging to trunks and roots. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the steady hum of an engine reached their ears. A small plane flew low over the trees. Of course, they were invisible through the dense green canopy. Still, for Dave, the logic was simple and immediate. A private plane in this wilderness could only mean one thing. His parents had organized a search. The thought that their desperate efforts had stretched thousands of miles to this point on the map became a powerful psychological anchor for him, and his hope, which had almost faded, was rekindled. By 6 o'clock in the evening, when their time was up, the flooded forest gave way to a broad, 260-foot river. Then Crystal, whose gaze had been almost indifferent, suddenly froze. She pointed to a bend in the river. "Is that real? Can you see people?" Dave squinted. 2 dark dots were moving slowly across the water. They were canoes. Their voices, weakened by hunger, faltered, but despair gave them strength. The canoes responded and began to paddle faster. Denilson Elson, a local hunter, was returning from fishing with his cousin Guido. In the morning, he heard a message on the radio from the hostel owner. "If you find 2 lost Americans, treat them like family." When a search plane flew low at noon, Denilson realized that the Americans were somewhere nearby. He decided to change course and paddle in the direction of the engine noise. The canoes approached slowly. The river was wide and deep, but every second seemed like an eternity. Dave and Crystal paddled toward them, using their last ounce of strength. When the canoe was level with them, Denilson reached out his hand. Dave grabbed it and felt the first warm and strong touch of another person in 6 days. Exhausted, they were pulled into the boats. Once on board, unable to utter a word, their bodies began to shake uncontrollably, a reaction to the stress and exhaustion they had endured. When the sun touched the horizon, their 6-day period had expired, but now they were safe. The residents of the village of Alto Alegre welcomed them like family. Despite their own poverty, they gave everything they could: clean clothes, hot food, and medicine to treat their wounds. Dava and Crystal were placed in a school that had been converted into a temporary hospital. Local women took turns staying with them, giving them warm tea with sugar and soup. 2 days later, they were taken to a hospital in the city of Maués. The doctors were amazed at their relatively good condition. Yes, they had lost a lot of weight, and yes, their bodies were covered with hundreds of bites and wounds from thorns. However, they had no serious tropical diseases, and no cases of frostbite. Dave called his parents from the hospital and said to them for the first time in his life, "I love you." They remained in Brazil until mid-July. Dave insisted on returning to the village of Alto Alegre with gifts for those who had saved them. They brought clothes, medicine, and toys for the children. The town threw a real celebration in their honor with music and dancing, but the most serious changes awaited them at home. Dave radically revised his life priorities. He left economics and became a science teacher in a high school. He built a house using solar and geothermal energy. He organized a fundraiser to protect jaguars in Bolivia, inspired by Crystal's work with big cats. But there was one obsession in his life. Dave was convinced that their joint survival in the jungle was fate, a sign that they were meant to be together. For the next 10 years, he hoped to reunite with Crystal, which prevented him from forming relationships with other women. It was only in 2012, 10 years after the Amazon, that he accepted the fact that their paths had diverged forever. Crystal moved to Southern California and became a volunteer for a wildlife conservation organization in Bolivia. She continued to work with big cats, but the jungle had left a deep mark on her psyche. Her depression worsened, requiring long-term treatment. Their story became a cautionary tale for thousands of tourists. A simple misunderstanding of one word set off a chain of events that nearly cost them their lives. In the Amazon jungle, there are no small things. There are only decisions, each of which could be your last. However, it also became proof of what a person is capable of when their life is on the line. Statistics say that the chances of surviving in the jungle without training after 72 hours are less than 10%. Dave and Crystal lasted 144 hours and remained alive. They were saved by mutual support, rational decisions at critical moments, and a bit of luck. But most importantly, they were saved by the kindness of strangers who heard their call for help and did not pass by. Dave and Crystal's story prompts reflection on the fine line between dreams and recklessness. Can their behavior be called irresponsible? Two young Americans went into the jungle without a map, food supplies, or proper equipment. On the other hand, they trusted the local hostel owner, who assured them that the route was safe. Where is the line between reasonable caution and paranoid fear of travel? And can we condemn people who, in a state of extreme exhaustion and despair, choose a controlled departure from life over a slow agony? Or does this decision show that the human spirit is capable of maintaining dignity even in the face of death? Their rescue was made possible by the simple human kindness of Adelson Elson, who heard the radio message and decided to help the strangers. In a world where we increasingly hear about human cruelty, such examples make us believe in the best. Write in the comments what you think. Were Dave and Crystal irresponsible tourists or just victims of an accident? Is it worth risking your life to fulfill a childhood dream? Thank you for watching the video to the end. Take care and see you in the next episodes.